It began years before that morning, long before anyone in the unit even knew her name. The pendant she wore was not decoration. It was history, forged in silence and memory. The design was simple, a small, oval shape with worn edges, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice twice unless you were looking for it. But for those who knew its origin, it carried a weight that could stop a heartbeat. It belonged to a time when choices were made under fire, and loyalty was tested not in words, but in the sound of gunfire echoing through smoke. That pendant had once belonged to another soldier, one whose name was buried deep within classified reports. He was a man who had saved his entire team at the cost of his own life. His mission was never spoken of publicly, but those who had been there remembered every moment. The chaos, the blood, the radio static cutting out just before he made his final call. He'd told them he was holding the line, that he'd make sure the others got out. And he did. But when they returned, all that came back from the field was that pendant. Years passed. The team was reassigned, reorganized, and the story faded into the gray areas of military silence. The pendant was sent back to his family, but somehow, through paths no one could trace, it found its way to her. She wore it not for style or remembrance of a stranger, but for something deeper, a promise made to someone she once trusted, a connection to a truth that never made it into the reports. She had been there too, though no one knew. Not officially. Her name had been erased, her involvement marked non-existent. But she carried the only proof that she had once been part of that doomed mission, the small, dented pendant that now hung over her heart. When she arrived at the new unit, she said nothing about her past. She blended in, followed orders, never drew attention. She was sharp, disciplined, but quiet, the kind of soldier who got things done without making noise. The others respected her, though they didn't know much about her. And she preferred it that way. The less they knew, the safer everyone was. The pendant stayed tucked under her collar, never visible during drills or briefings. Until that morning. It happened by accident. The room was tense. Everyone gathered around the colonel as he outlined the new mission. She leaned forward slightly to look at the map, and the chain slipped from beneath her uniform. The small piece of metal caught the morning light, just enough for the colonel to see it. He froze mid-sentence. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he didn't breathe. The air in the room shifted. No one else noticed, but she did. She saw the way his hand trembled ever so slightly before tightening on the edge of the table. He recognized it instantly. That pendant had once hung around the neck of his best man, the one who had saved his life years ago. He'd been there that night. The ambush, the retreat, the explosion. He'd carried the guilt of surviving while his comrade never made it out. And now, years later, it was back in front of him, resting against the chest of a woman who shouldn't have had it. His mind flooded with questions, but his training kept his face neutral. Still, the silence between them stretched long enough for everyone in the room to feel something had shifted, though no one knew what. She didn't flinch. She saw the recognition in his eyes, the storm building behind his composed expression. For a second, neither of them moved. There was something raw in that stare, shock, anger, disbelief, but also a trace of something else, grief. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was proof that a ghost from his past still lingered, carried quietly by someone he didn't yet understand. The colonel continued the briefing as if nothing had happened, but his voice had changed, lower, heavier. Every word came slower, more deliberate. The others took notes, unaware that an old story was unfolding silently between the two of them. When the meeting ended, she tucked the pendant back under her collar and turned to leave, but before she could, he spoke her name, not the one on her file, but another one, the one that had been erased. That stopped her in her tracks. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, a name tied to the mission that was never supposed to exist. The pendant between them had just broken open a past that neither of them could continue to hide. It wasn't just metal, it was memory, pain, and survival wrapped in silence. It was a symbol of everything they had lost and everything they had buried. And in that instant, without a word spoken, both of them knew that nothing in their world was going to remain the same. The moment the colonel's eyes landed on that pendant, time seemed to fracture into two realities, the one they were standing in and the one he thought he had buried years ago. His expression didn't change much at first, just a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, a brief pause in his breath. But for someone who had spent his entire career mastering control, that single flicker said everything. His subordinates kept listening, oblivious, but his thoughts were already miles away, trapped in the echo of a night that had never left him. He had seen that pendant before, not in photographs or memories, but in the final moment of a mission that went horribly wrong. Back then, it had glinted faintly under the glow of burning vehicles and falling ash. It had belonged to his second-in-command, a man who'd refused to retreat, who'd held off enemy fire to buy the team their escape. The colonel had been forced to give the order to leave him behind. It had been the right call tactically, but morally, it had destroyed him. For years, that pendant had haunted his dreams. Seeing it now, around her neck, was like watching a ghost walk back into the room. He tried to continue the briefing, his voice steady, but his pulse betrayed him. Every word he spoke was threaded with confusion. Who was she really? Why did she have it? His mind searched for logical explanations. Maybe she'd found it somewhere. Maybe it was coincidence. But the rational part of him was slipping. He couldn't stop staring. Her posture, her calmness, even the quiet focus in her eyes. It was familiar. Too familiar. He'd seen those same eyes once, through a haze of smoke and fear, when the operation had fallen apart. It couldn't be her, he told himself. That woman hadn't survived. But the more he looked, the more his denial faltered. She stood at attention, perfectly still, waiting for his orders. Nothing in her expression revealed that she noticed his reaction, but she had. She knew. She'd known this moment would come sooner or later, that someone from that night would recognize the pendant and the story attached to it. She just hadn't expected it to be him. The colonel's words trailed off mid-sentence. He caught himself, cleared his throat, and forced the meeting to continue. He shifted the focus back to logistics, tactics, coordinates, anything to anchor himself in the present, but every few seconds, his eyes betrayed him. They kept drifting back to that small silver shape resting just beneath her collarbone. The rest of the room faded into static. He remembered the promise he'd made to his fallen brother, that he'd find whoever carried the truth, that he wouldn't let the mission die in silence. And now, that truth was standing right in front of him, disguised as an ordinary soldier. The irony wasn't lost on him. The military had buried everything about that operation, sealed it behind layers of clearance and rewritten records. If this woman was here, wearing that pendant openly, it meant the past had found a way to resurface, and it had chosen him to face it. He dismissed the team earlier than usual. No one questioned it. When the last person left the room, the air grew heavier. She stayed behind, not moving, not speaking. The silence stretched long enough to feel like a confrontation without words. The colonel's eyes softened for the briefest moment before hardening again. He wanted to demand answers, but something held him back. Maybe fear, maybe respect. He studied her carefully, the way her fingers brushed the edge of the table, the way her jaw set slightly, betraying nerves she was trying to hide. He recognized that same controlled defiance from the battlefield. There was no mistake now. She wasn't just someone who'd heard the story, she'd lived it. Memories surged uninvited. He could almost hear the rain hitting the metal of the crashed transport, the distant shouts, the last message over comms. "Tell them I held the line," his brother-in-arms had said. Then the signal had cut out. The colonel had replayed that line 1,000 times in his head over the years, but now he realized there had been someone else there, someone who had heard it too, someone who had seen the truth firsthand. He stepped closer, his boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. The pendant caught the light again, and for a second, it was as if the ghosts of the past filled the room. He didn't need to ask where she got it. The look in her eyes told him she had earned it. That knowledge hit him harder than any bullet could. The silence between them was dense, unspoken words forming a wall neither dared to break. He wanted to ask if she had been the one who carried the body, the one who sent the pendant home, the one who had lived in the shadow of that night just as he had. But questions felt meaningless. The truth was already written in the tension between them. She had returned not to seek recognition, but because she had a purpose that went beyond the past. He finally looked away, trying to regain control, but the damage was done. The room, the briefing, the mission, all of it had changed in that single instant. The pendant had become a reminder that the ghosts he tried to bury were not gone. They were standing right in front of him, alive, breathing, and wearing the memory he had tried to forget. It was strange how something so small could carry so much weight. The pendant was barely the size of a coin, yet inside it rested a story soaked in sacrifice and betrayal. To most, it was just a dull piece of metal hanging from a chain, but for those who knew its history, it was a symbol of choices that had broken people. It had been passed from one set of hands to another, always in silence, always under circumstances no one dared to speak of. It wasn't a medal of honor or a token of recognition. It was a burden, a reminder of what had been done and what could never be undone. Years before that morning, when the colonel first saw it again, the pendant had been part of a mission that was never officially acknowledged. A covert operation that went wrong from the start, led by men and women who trusted one another with their lives. Orders had been unclear, intelligence incomplete, but they went in anyway because that was what soldiers did. They trusted the chain of command, believed that someone, somewhere, knew the full picture. They were wrong. The mission turned into chaos within hours, and by dawn, half the team was gone. The colonel, then just a field officer, had made a decision that would haunt him for years. A transmission came through, retreat immediately. He followed it, pulling his remaining men out under heavy fire. But the man who stayed behind, the one who refused to leave without completing the objective, was the one who wore that pendant. He had promised to hold the position until the others reached safety. When communication finally went dark, the explosion that followed told them everything. The colonel ordered the extraction, but he knew deep down he had left a man to die. The official report said the operation was compromised, that everyone followed protocol. The truth was simpler and crueler. Trust had been broken somewhere far above them, and they had been the ones to pay for it. The pendant was recovered weeks later during a covert cleanup. No body, no trace of survival, just the pendant, twisted and blackened from heat. It was sent back through channels, logged as personal item, and quietly forgotten. But the truth didn't stay buried. Someone else had seen what really happened that night. Someone had survived. She had been there, a young operative assigned to surveillance, working under a different call sign. She wasn't supposed to be in the field, but when the mission collapsed, she was forced into the chaos. She saw the betrayal unfold, not from the enemy, but from within their own command. She saw the hesitation in the colonel's eyes when the retreat order came, the split-second moment when duty outweighed emotion. And when the fire consumed everything, she had crawled through the wreckage, searching for any sign of life. All she found was that pendant, half buried in the mud beside a broken weapon. She could have handed it in like protocol demanded, but she didn't. She kept it, not because of sentiment, but because she knew what it represented. It was evidence, not just of a fallen comrade, but of a decision that had cost more than anyone admitted. For years, she carried it quietly, never speaking of it, never showing it. It reminded her of what loyalty meant, and how fragile it could be when orders turned men into ghosts. When she finally reappeared in the colonel's unit years later, she wore the pendant again, not as accusation or revenge, but as a silent truth that refused to die. The betrayal that pendant carried wasn't about a single mission. It was about a system that demanded obedience even when it tore people apart. It was about a leader who had to choose between his men and his orders, and a soldier who never stopped believing the mission still mattered. The colonel's eyes had always been sharp, but when he saw that pendant, they dimmed. It was like seeing his own guilt reflected back at him. The betrayal wasn't only his to bear, but he carried it heavier than anyone. He had written the reports, justified the choices, buried the names. But now, standing in front of him was someone who had lived through the aftermath, someone who had carried the truth while he carried the silence. To her, the pendant was not revenge, it was remembrance. But to him, it was a wound that reopened the moment he saw it. Every gleam of metal was a whisper of that night, of the friend he couldn't save, of the chain of command that had failed them both. The betrayal it symbolized wasn't born from malice. It was born from war itself, from the cruel arithmetic of survival. The pendant hung there, quiet and unassuming, but it drew invisible lines through the room. It separated those who knew from those who didn't, those who followed orders from those who paid for them. It was the kind of symbol that demanded no explanation because its weight could be felt just by looking at it. It was the story of loyalty turned into loss, of trust shattered under the sound of distant gunfire, and of the price both of them had paid to keep breathing when others could not. There was something unspoken between them long before either of them realized it. a kind of understanding that didn't need words, the kind forged not through comfort or affection, but through the weight of shared silence. The colonel and the woman with the pendant never exchanged much more than orders and acknowledgments. Yet beneath every brief interaction, there was a pulse of recognition neither could explain away. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't duty. It was something older, deeper, a connection built on pain both of them carried but never named. From the moment he saw her, there had been something in her eyes that unsettled him. Calm, precise, disciplined, but there was a flicker there, like someone who had already seen too much, who had made peace with ghosts. He'd seen that look before in soldiers who had survived when they shouldn't have. It was the look of someone who no longer feared death because they had already met it once. The colonel couldn't place it at first, but every time their paths crossed, he found himself searching for a reason why she felt so familiar. For her, the bond was heavier. She had carried the pendant for years, but now she found herself working under the man whose decisions had shaped the tragedy behind it. She had watched him from a distance during briefings, trying to see whether the years had changed him, whether the guilt still lived behind his eyes. She knew he didn't recognize her, not yet. Her name, her identity, everything that could have connected them had been erased after that mission. But the way he moved, the way he paused before giving a critical order, it was the same man who had hesitated that night. She remembered the tone of his voice over the radio, the final command that sealed another man's fate. Still, she couldn't bring herself to hate him. Time had done something strange to her anger. It had turned it into understanding. She had seen enough since then to know that the choices made in war were never simple. The colonel had done what he thought was right, what any commanding officer might have done with the information he had. But that didn't make the outcome easier to live with. Every time she touched the pendant, she remembered the sound of that last transmission and the voice that said, "Tell him it wasn't his fault." The colonel carried his own ghosts quietly. On the outside, he was all authority, structure, and calm control. But inside, he lived with the memory of that night as though it had just happened. He still woke up sometimes hearing the static of a broken comm line. He'd spent years convincing himself that what happened was inevitable, that he had made the only choice he could. And yet, the sight of that pendant undid everything. It reminded him that the past wasn't finished with him, that somewhere out there, pieces of that story still existed. Now, standing right in front of him. The way they looked at each other changed after that morning. It was subtle, invisible to everyone else, but to them, every glance was weighted with something unsaid. During drills, he found himself watching her longer than necessary, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She reminded him of discipline wrapped in silence, of a kind of strength he hadn't seen since the old days. She, on the other hand, noticed his restraint, the way he tried to keep his voice steady when giving her orders, the way he avoided standing too close, as if proximity might bring the truth closer too. They were bound by something that neither of them had chosen. The unspoken bond between them wasn't built on shared experience alone. It was built on the same guilt and grief, reflected from two different angles. She had survived the betrayal and carried its proof. He had made the decision that caused it and carried its weight. Together, they embodied two halves of the same story, the victim and the commander, both broken in their own ways, both unwilling to admit it. Sometimes, late after training, when the others had left, they would cross paths in the quiet hallways of the base. A simple nod, nothing more. But those nods carried a history too heavy for words. He wanted to ask her how she got it, why she wore it, what she knew. She wanted to ask him if he remembered their faces, if he thought about the ones left behind. But neither spoke. The silence between them was not avoidance. It was respect. They both understood that words could only ruin something that had already been perfectly fragile. There was a strange comfort in that silence. It was the kind that only exists between people who have lived through the same storm, even if they were on different sides of it. She no longer saw him as the man who gave the order. She saw him as another casualty of that night, someone who had carried his own punishment far longer than anyone had asked him to. And he, in her, saw the ghost of a life he couldn't save, the reflection of a story that refused to stay buried. Their bond wasn't forged in forgiveness or redemption. It existed because neither of them could undo what had been done. It existed because the pendant she wore was not just his past, it was theirs. And no matter how much time passed, it would hang between them, invisible to everyone else, a silent reminder of the choices that had bound them together forever. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't happen in an explosion of words or an official confession. It happened in fragments, quiet moments, small exchanges, pieces of information slipping through the cracks until the full picture came together. It began with a report, a classified document that somehow ended up on the colonel's desk. At first, it looked like any other debrief summary, but buried inside were familiar names, coordinates, and a mission code he hadn't seen in years. The date on it matched the night everything went wrong. His heart slowed as he read, the words swimming on the page, and then stopping cold on a single line. Survivor confirmed. Recovered item, identification pendant. He looked up from the file and saw her standing just outside his office, waiting for orders. In that moment, the weight of every unanswered question became unbearable. He realized that all the years of silence, all the guilt he had carried, had been shared by someone else who had lived the same story. The truth wasn't buried in reports or command briefings. It was standing in front of him, wearing the same piece of metal that had haunted him since that night. He called her in without knowing what he was going to say. She entered quietly, posture straight, eyes steady. The air between them was heavy, and for a long time, neither spoke. The file lay open on his desk, the words blurring under the dim light. Finally, he slid the paper toward her. She glanced at it, saw the mission code, and didn't even blink. She had known this moment was coming. He asked the question that had been living in his throat since the first day he saw her. "Where did you get it?" Her answer came softly, without hesitation. "From the fire. I was there." That was all she said, but it was enough to shatter the illusion he had built for years. She wasn't just connected to the story, she was the missing piece of it. He sat back, every muscle in his body tightening as the realization settled. She had survived the mission no one else was supposed to survive. She had watched everything fall apart, had seen the betrayal from inside the chaos. And she had carried the truth all this time, quietly, without exposing anyone. She hadn't come back for revenge or recognition. She had come because she couldn't let the truth die buried under lies. As she spoke, pieces of that night came back to him with painful clarity. The confusion, the radio static, the desperate call that had cut out too soon. He remembered giving the order to retreat, believing it would save the rest of his team. What he hadn't known was that she had stayed behind, helping the man who wore that pendant hold off the enemy while they escaped. She had seen him fall, had taken the pendant from his body, and carried it through the wreckage. She had walked alone through the rain, covered in ash and blood, holding on to the only piece of proof that their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. When she finished speaking, the room was silent. The colonel's hands trembled against the desk, but he didn't hide it. The truth wasn't easy to face. He had lived with a version of events that helped him sleep at night, but now that version was gone. The betrayal hadn't come from her or the fallen soldier. It had come from above, from the false orders sent through command to cover up a political mistake. They had been pawns, expendable pieces in a game they never agreed to play. He felt the rage and sorrow rise in him, a storm he'd spent years suppressing. For a moment, he looked at her not as a subordinate, but as a survivor who had carried the truth when no one else dared to. Their eyes met, and everything that had been hidden between them came to light. The truth had finally surfaced, not through confrontation, but through the courage of one woman who refused to let the story end in silence. Word spread slowly through the ranks. No one knew details, but everyone felt the shift in the air. The colonel began moving differently, his tone heavier, his decisions sharper. She, too, carried herself with a quiet assurance, as if a long-held burden had finally lightened, even slightly. They both understood that knowing the truth didn't erase the past, it only exposed it. The cost of that revelation wasn't small. It changed how the colonel saw his own command, how he viewed loyalty, how he interpreted obedience. It reminded him that sometimes, doing the right thing came too late, but it still had to be done. When he saw her in training the next morning, their eyes met again, and for a split second, there was understanding, something between respect and regret. The pendant hung in plain sight now, not hidden, not explained. The truth was out, even if only between them. It had changed everything about the way they looked at their past, their choices, their silence. The walls of secrecy had cracked open, and for the first time in years, the ghosts had names again. Sometimes the smallest things carry the heaviest stories. The pendant had never been meant to draw attention. It wasn't polished or valuable, not the kind of thing that belonged in a museum or a display case. But the weight it carried couldn't be measured in metal. It carried promises, last words, and truths that had survived longer than any of the people who made them. It was proof that what mattered most often wasn't the grand speeches or the medals pinned to a chest. It was the quiet symbols that held memories no one dared to speak aloud. For her, the pendant was a reminder of why she had kept going. Every mission, every order, every sleepless night, it was there against her skin, a silent heartbeat of the past she refused to forget. It wasn't about grief anymore. It was about purpose. Each time she touched it, she remembered the man who had given everything so others could live, and the leader who had carried the weight of that choice ever since. It reminded her that courage didn't always look like charging into battle. Sometimes, it looked like carrying a burden long after the fighting stopped. The colonel saw it differently, but he understood its power just the same. To him, the pendant was a mirror. Every time he looked at it, he saw not just what he'd lost, but who he'd become because of it. He had spent years building walls around his conscience, convincing himself that duty had to come before emotion, that leadership required sacrifice. But that small piece of metal broke through every layer of armor he had built. It forced him to remember that orders might end wars, but it was humanity that saved lives. In the days after the truth surfaced, something began to shift in the unit. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it. The colonel's commands became less mechanical, his tone softer when he addressed his soldiers. He started asking questions he had never asked before, about their well-being, their thoughts, their reasons for serving. He stopped being just a commanding officer and started becoming something more human. The pendant had done what years of war could not. It reminded him of what leadership truly meant. She noticed the change, though she never mentioned it. In training, in briefings, in the long hours that blurred together, she could see that he was trying to make peace with himself. The distance between them was still there, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like shared ground, uneven but real. The pendant had connected them in a way no words ever could. It had turned two separate lives, marked by guilt and silence, into something like understanding. It wasn't about redemption. Neither of them believed in that. It was about recognition, the quiet acceptance that some things can't be fixed, only carried. They both carried it in their own ways. For her, it was the chain around her neck. For him, it was the memory in his mind. The pendant was a symbol, but it was also a teacher. It taught them that the smallest gestures could bear the greatest meaning, that a life could be remembered not through grand honors, but through the silent weight of a single keepsake. Others began to notice, too. The younger recruits sometimes caught sight of the pendant and asked about it, curious. She never told them the whole story. Instead, she'd say, "It belonged to someone who reminded me what strength really is." That was all. It was enough. They didn't need to know the pain behind it. They only needed to feel the message it carried, that even in the harshest places, humanity could survive in small, unbreakable ways. The colonel, meanwhile, carried his own version of that lesson. He stopped hiding behind the image of perfection that military life demanded. He began to admit, quietly, that he didn't have all the answers, that leadership wasn't about control but about responsibility. He realized that the choices that defined a person weren't made in the heat of battle. They were made afterward, in the silence, when you decided how to live with what you'd done. The pendant became more than a symbol of loss. It became a symbol of endurance. It reminded them that every scar, every sacrifice, every painful memory still had meaning. It was proof that even broken things could hold something sacred. It reminded her that forgiveness wasn't always spoken. Sometimes it was simply lived. It reminded him that even when the past couldn't be rewritten, it could still be honored. And so, the pendant remained, resting quietly against her heart. It had survived fire, betrayal, and time itself. It carried within it the story of those who had given everything, and those who had been left to remember. It was the smallest thing, and yet it bore the entire weight of two lives intertwined by fate, by war, and by the choice to keep carrying forward when everything else had fallen away.